So we're going to try to bring Travis. By the way, this is Travis Hall, my colleague from NTIA, who runs our privacy work and is stepping in to take some notes. And we're going to try to move over here so that we can take some live notes up here. If this works, this will be much better because that way you will be able to sort of see what we're capturing and make sure that everyone is on the same page about what's being said. Again, we're not all going to agree on the final outcome or the point of it, but we can say, at least let's make sure that we're talking about the same thing. So let's try that. It's up there, I think. For those of you who are on the call, for those of you watching, thank you for watching. If you are on the call, we acknowledge that there's a little bit of a delay. We're working on it. Hopefully for the next live meeting, we will have a solution that actually doesn't have the gap between the call and the video feed. If you would like to participate and you're on the call, you can hit *1 at any time, and that will get you into the Q&A, and you will speak to us from the ceiling, and we will learn of your wisdom and all be better for it. So please, I hope you are ready to contribute and participate. We have 4 great resources, and this is fantastic. But of course, we're here to sort of review what might be coming next. Thanks. And so what we wanted to do is, as you can see, as soon as we start talking specifics, we all rush in because we're all very good at what we do and have strong thoughts about how this can help. But before we get to there, I thought it'd be useful to talk a little bit about the high-level goals. As someone framed it this morning, a year from now, where do we want to be? What are some of the things that we want to have at our disposal? And so then we can work backwards into figuring out how that can happen. So this is where I get to turn the floor over to you, and you can chime in. And I will check the phone lines to see if we have, you're on the phone again, *1 will get you there. I see we have Claude. Claude Baudouin, you are, if we can hear you.
Hi, can you hear me, Alan?
We can, yes, thank you.
Oh, it's a question I was asking much earlier, but before the system was ready to take that. My question is, who has considered, and what can you say about integrating SBOM with the rest of the BOM? So if you have a product which is a combination of hardware and software, is there going to be an issue if SBOM uses different formats, or has there been any input either from users or any discussion about how you integrate SBOM within a traditional BOM?
That's a great question, and I want to turn it back out to the community, but it also is a note that someone who was listening earlier and had to drop off but sent me an email saying that it's important to put the SBOM work in this broader context, where supply chain has been a priority across the U.S. government, the intelligence community, DoD, DHS. There is the very high-level White House-run FASC, Federal Assurance Supply Chain, and of course there's the work that Bob Kolaski is running over at DHS on supply chain risk management. That's a public-private partnership with a lot of industry input. And one of the things going forward is, at very least, we need to make sure that we can coordinate and ideally find, good ways of being constructive. Sometimes it's going to, I think, look like saying, listen, the work that you're doing is great. We'll leave a little hole. We won't touch this. You keep doing what you're doing. And other folks may, in turn, reciprocate to the work that you're doing. Other times it's going to be, hey, we need to actually find some good ways to hook into this. So, Claude, do you have an answer to the question that you posed?
Unfortunately, no, Alan. Not directly. I just think that when we look at standards and format it might be important to look at what is being used for product bombs. I also think the question that was raised earlier, I think it was maybe by Michelle, about, you can't do a bomb with relations in Excel. The bomb or the people who do bills of materials in ERP systems or MRP systems must have resolved this. So we probably would need to look at that.
And I think the challenge, again, that the folks in the physical domain are also wrestling with is on the assurance side, right? So which is the attention is not going to be what is the chip. It's the validating that the chip, that the SKU actually maps to the trusted chip that I tested in my special facility. That's something that has a lot of attention across the U.S. government because it's very real for national security. I won't mention the newspaper article from last fall that set everyone on fire, but this is something that's been real, and there was just an article a few days ago where someone had demonstrated a proof of concept in actual hardware tampering. So an important thing that we need to make sure that we can dock with those efforts. Thank you, Claude. So let's go back to this question of goals. Where would you like to be a year from now? Ideally not in a conference room in Washington, D.C. Start us up.
So that everyone, not just us, but outside this room, uses the same terminology and actually does some of the stuff we're talking about.
So awareness and adoption.
Yes.
Cool. On the phone, we have Bruce.
Can you hear me?
We can, thanks.
Yeah, one of the things I would like to see, and the question I was actually going to talk about was a while ago, so I'll answer that one first. Is I'd like to see us prioritize things that we need to address, and I would say that the proof of concept work will aid us in figuring out what's important to address first. And the things I saw there were, and maybe I didn't get them all, were end of life, naming, risk management, which I guess had to do with exploitability and versus vulnerabilities, or what's exploitable. Where would I like to be in a year? I like the terminology straightened out, because that way we can at least communicate. And it's been an issue that we've seen in our discussions quite often, and it's extremely important. But I would like to see, personally, enough defined so we can have a really decent proof of concept, and addressing the items that they brought up, I think would be essential in terms of saying, here we really made progress because now we can do a proof of concept that's real. And here's our results.
I like that. Thank you. And I just want to very quickly flag for the note takers, as we talk about terminology and definitions, something that we can return to is what's the current lay of the land? Where are the gaps? Where is the miscommunication? What have we seen? What's that going to look like? So we can come back to that. But I want to keep focusing on the goals. And I'm sorry.
So my name is Chris Clark with Synopsys. Actually, I have two items. The first is I've heard a lot of discussions about proof of concepts, and I think one of the things that will be key is to have a clear roadmap of what wants to be achieved, or what the goals are to be achieved, so that tool providers can move along with the organization. So, at the end of the completion of the document, it's not 2-year delay or a year delay for software development to catch up with what the goals of the requirements are. And my second part is what I would also like to see, just coming back from Japan. I spent last week there talking with a number of automotive manufacturers that are very interested in what is NTI doing. So having, I know this is more of a U.S.-centric activity right now, but having more of a global presentation so that other nations can either follow along or participate in some form.
Thank you. That's great idea on the global side of things, and it's got to be something that all of us have to do. I was just in Japan as well, but that was a sector that I didn't get a chance to chat with when I was there. So I've got Art, and then Jim, and then Josh on the phone.
Sure. Mine's very short. Global identification, universal ID of components is a hard problem. It's enumerated in the healthcare proof of concept. I think that needs to be worked on further. Probably, fortunately, other parts of the world have partially solved this. We should look to them. But I think that needs more attention, 100%. I'm happy with the 18 months or so of work we've done so far, a lot of the writing and thinking and talking. I'm very happy to have had the healthcare proof of concept happen, and it's time to do some more testing, in my opinion. So just getting in, adding my +1 to the demonstration, experimentation, proof of concept to figure out how good our theory has been and how to fix it, basically. So.
Thank you. Jim?
I'd like to, I think we are ready to take on topics such as automation and tooling. I think we also would benefit from getting to the state of practice where we could have that universal translator so we divorce ourselves from the need to identify standards that can work and identify the information that's necessary and spread out from there.
Great, I like it. We've got Josh on the phone, and then Lori in the room.
Couple things to build on. I think the group did a lot of amazing work. We had to take the path that we had to take, as with any multi-stakeholder model, where people are starting the journey at different points of experience. One of the places we abandoned early, maybe out of necessity, but I really want us to get back to, is there are very mature practices within financial services, within organizations that have traditionally used software composition analysis tools like Black Duck or Codenomicon or Sonatype or whatnot, and JC's company. And they can do the am I affected, where am I affected for thousands of internally written and internally developed applications, and have been for some time. So they have very mature processes. I think the logic jump that this group wasn't ready for, but perhaps is now ready for, is it's not about the process of doing highly automated, standardized SBOM creation and utilization within an organization like a big bank. There's an entire market, for this, and compound annual growth rate and hundreds or thousands of customers. I think the logic gap has been transitioning between organizational boundaries. So if you produce software to be consumed by a hospital or by a factory, handing it between your org that could have created it and has mature practices to another org to consume it, has been our challenge. I don't think it's insurmountable. You do have case examples of that as well, such as Philips Medical has been publishing a more handcrafted SBOM in their MDS2 labels vehicles for quite some time to their customers, and more are looking to do so right now. So I really like us now that we can shift from very homogenous, industry agnostic framing that we've done in these four documents, that I hope and believe that if we pivot back to adoption awareness, we can make more industry specific things where the nouns and verbs will be more recognizable. We call it procurement for a bank, but it's called acquisition for the Pentagon. So perhaps our attempt to make a generic whole was absolutely necessary prerequisite, but now let's pivot into what is your sector already doing? What's the nouns and verbs your sector uses? What does the wonderful Audi purple graphic look like instead of an infusion pump, maybe with a vehicle, or the commercial off-the-shelf software look like? And I think that will not so much be building from, cutting from whole cloth, but rather finally unleashing and unlocking 6-7 years of mature practice in some spots, but getting us over the hump of sharing those SBOM artifacts across organizational boundaries. And then lastly, just because Bruce mentioned it and I am living it right now, I am, as a compound part supplier, constructing our SBOMs to be given to my customers who make final goods assembled. And in the process of doing that, we're absolutely going to need to come up with a consistent way for me to make a persistent attestation of exploitability across stakeholders in time, whether it's on my website or somewhere else. But this will be the most painful thing if we get it wrong, and the most valuable thing if we get it right. People don't want to see a list of over 100 potentially exploitable vulnerabilities without some sort of disposition. But they also don't want to be blind to maybe dozens of exploitable vulnerabilities because people weren't previously willing to share those. So that's a priority for me too.
That's a really good point. Josh, I want to flag something you said and bounce it back to one of the other ideas that was raised in the room. Is you sort of talked about the benefits of sector-specific thinking and language. And we also have this sort of hope of having a common way or a global way of talking about SBOM. Do you see that we can do both of those, or do you think we should really be prioritizing one over the other?
I think we've done the heavy lifting of the common vernacular. I think mapping it back to how people see it and speak it, it may not change the way they talk, but a Rosetta Stone. Technology is good at this. It could even be a graphic that just shows when we say procurement, here's the industry-specific language in a table. I think that's part of the adoption and awareness, but I do think the outreach will be, let's go to the canonical, I just say canonical, let's go to the quintessential conference for this sector, and let's do a panel with people they recognize and maybe some people they don't recognize to spread the good word of SBOM and who's doing it in their sector already and how they have done it. Maybe they're a panelist. So I don't think this is going to be more than a mapping exercise for most cases. But if they don't recognize their own language, this document as it stands may be inaccessible.
Sure, that's good. Art, are you doing a two-finger injection here, which is the practice, which is, by the way, if you have something that is incredibly relevant and must be part of the ongoing thread, this is, unfortunately for the folks in the room, you can raise two fingers and we'll try to we'll allow a queue jump. We just will try to make sure that folks don't abuse it. You've got 1.5 fingers. All right, Art, then Lori.
I will be brief at least. Sorry. I noticed Michelle had to step out, perhaps my co-chair for the framing group, but she and I have been talking about sort of a meta issue for the next round of increased collaboration or coordination across the working groups. We had considered how exactly to pull that off. We're not sure yet, and that tactical decision might depend on what we're trying to do in the first place, which is the first question to answer. If it's possible, once we get to that point, perhaps some coordination further help, or resource from the NTIA might be, useful to the chairs. We're all busy. Even some reminders. Make sure you have your status report in at a certain time. So help organize that information might be helpful moving forward. Again, once we've set our goals, some extra resource there. Thank you.
Duncan, I want to get to the how a little bit later. I still want to focus on the what, but.
Yeah, no, this was more to his point on organization. I was going to make the point, let's do the goals first before we decide how we're organized.
Yes. Lori, thank you for your patience.
Okay. My kind of where I would like to see this go, other than if I would be able to accomplish or not, is that to have a kind of convincing enough economical model which will especially gear towards developer side. So they would see that this is actually profitable and it's overcoming the demerits which they perceive right now. Thank you.
And do you have some targeted audiences? One of the challenges that we often face here is the difference between automotive and medical and someone who's just in modern containerized world. They're facing different challenges. Is there a starting point or a theme that you have in mind to start that?
Not specifically, but I think you got to start where the pain is the worst. So we have, or the medical POC is probably a really high risk area, but the other parts are probably going to the cloud SaaS, which has a lot of vulnerabilities and should be maintained a little bit better. That might be next step. I'm not sure about that really.
Thanks. Further goals. Duncan, and then Michael on the phone.
Thanks. So one that I think would be important is if we do have an overall objective of eventually having increased the herd immunity, as we call it, of there being more of these things, we need some way to measure how we're progressing. So if some work could be done on somehow sampling, or I'm not sure how to do it, but I don't know the tactic, but the goal would be that we'd have some way to measure how this is taking across the industry. A second, just separate bullet, would be to get to beyond the included in the SBOM. So we sort of have a minimum SBOM, and it had a particular verb called included. And when we were doing a lot of studies early on, we had like 7 other things that could go in there, and we said, yeah, we'll do that downstream. I think we're ready for some of that downstream. And then the third one is, it sort of came up in an earlier discussion, but I think it should be a specific point. I do think we should work on model or sample, or I realize we're not all lawyers, but something to do with procurement language, something that is part of the awareness and adoption, some very specifics we can send out to other people who aren't quite as ingrained in all this. I mean, the talks that went on earlier were very informed, and if we all knew that much, it'd be great, but the people outside this room aren't going to, so we need somehow to give them stuff.
I think that's, I love the idea of model language, especially for the private sector. And I think it helps in both directions, right? If you are a customer, you want to be able to ask for something so that each of your suppliers is giving you something fairly similar. And almost more important, if you're a supplier, you don't want to have each of your customers asking for something quite different. So I think we can, again, have that scale by having that uniformity. I've got Michael on the phone, and then back to Chris.
On.
Hi, Michael.
Hi. Can you hear me all right?
We can.
First of all, thanks for raising the context issue. The point going forward that I want to put on the table is, I guess it was Michelle who raised it in the standards discussion. I think it's very important not to diminish the emphasis on pedigree as well as provenance. I think that it has significant implications for the acquisition model beyond just the source selection or buy, no buy decision. I think it goes to warranty enforcement, any potential litigation if there are faults assessed, to an understanding from a research context of where errors start to accumulate or faults can lurk or hide over long term. So I would not diminish pedigree as opposed to provenance if the bandwidth is there to maintain it.
And Michael, can you be a little more, as concrete and possible as your vision of this brave new world of pedigree data? Can you talk a little more about, what is your ideal case?
Well, to use her fairly simplistic model, knowing what's in the box versus knowing who touched the box or put things in the box is very important from a warranty enforcement perspective, from an understanding the actual nature of a threat perspective, from a attaching liability perspective if there is a dispute. It's much easier to do that if you have some transparency into the history of where the artifact has been. This may be more readily demonstrated in the hardware world than the software world, but one of the knocks on commercial open source has long been the sloppiness of the pedigree process and the uncertainty of the tagging. If we can begin, at least going forward, to have higher level standards for assuring the credibility of component elements, once they get into the cocktail of a final product, it should be easier to attribute exactly where the fault lies. Mm-hmm. That's going to be important for warranty enforcement and curing defects as much as it is for any legal liability consideration. But I think they're both relevant to different communities.
Great. Thank you. That's useful. Chris.
Yeah, I just wanted to circle back on the comment about material for helping organizations understand how to ask for SBOM material. 2015, 2016, when we were still Codenomicon and we were rolling out Protocode SC as a new product, we delivered open source language for that, and it was incredibly powerful because now customers knew what to ask for. Okay, I have a tool, I know what to ask for, now I know what I can do with that. So I'd like to back that and make sure that we circle back on that because it was, as I said, an extremely powerful tool at the time.
It's a powerful way and certainly fits in sort of the NTIA vision of saying this should be something that is driven by market demand, not transparency for its own sake. Yes, Charlie.
I would say more POCs active for industries, other areas of medical technology.
Other POCs in other industries, other areas of IT, medical technology, whatever, would be, I mean, I always think a POC is probably the best way to learn real things.
Sure. Do you want to touch on some of the conversation that you've had with the ISAC, or are you not comfortable?
Sure, no, that's fine, yeah. So as I mentioned, my company makes a lot of different things, but one of the key things we're looking at right now is automotive, and both OEMs and fellow suppliers to the automotive industry are very, very interested in doing POCs right now. And we're trying to figure out a way that there would be some sort of guidelines and maybe sort of how-tos and experience gained from the prior POC and how we might translate that into the next steps for some of these companies. And it'll probably start pretty small. One company will do it internally or with one OEM or whatever and expand from there. But it is happening, and it's a snowball rolling downhill right now.
Excellent. And I think one of the things that we'll want to do is say is that how comfortable is that happening in a way that can share and get input more publicly from some of the folks in this room?
That will be a topic,
yes.
Definitely.
We've got Josh on the phone.
This is maybe an internally focused goal, but it will bear fruit externally, I hope. I have love and admiration and respect for everybody that's done everything thus far in phase one. I do think we should strive to have some continuity of voice and through line and vision as we pivot into a lot of these phase two things. And a challenge I was going to throw down if I was in the room is, can each of us commit to bringing 2 or 3 net new voices from net new disciplines to these? We may find new leadership or new strong voices for the new task at hand that are fit for purpose. So I know in our very successful NTIA process on coordinated vulnerability disclosure, we had some PR people, some marketing people, some people good at surveys for the adoption and awareness things, and they may have been bored to tears on SPDX or SWID discussions, but might be incredibly valuable and invigorate some of the work we've already done for that next phase. So this is more of a how, but I'd really strongly encourage that we leverage the people in this room for continuity and grow and expand so that new people can take the torch for the next leg of the relay race with our help or without. And to that end, also, we should start acting more like a software development pipeline, maybe a little less waterfall between the 4 groups. But also, I want to push back on the notion that we should, have more deliberate duplicity. I think some good project management and sprints and digestible chunks of work that could be delivered asynchronously when ready may be, more compatible with the very type of next generation software we're trying to usher in.
I like that. Great comments on the process. I think we'll definitely spend some time this afternoon talking about process. And just on your point on the value of different disciplines, I think something that came up on Friday's use case call was some discussion on the value of thinking through branding. So if anyone is creative and has some ideas of, can we have an SBOM logo? Or just some way of conveying, gosh, here's this new thing. Let's actually find a better way to package it. What do we need to make it more digestible? I'm very, very happy that we have perhaps one of the shortest URLs of any government program, ntia.gov/SBOM. But still not quite enough to say, hey, go to this website and read these 4 white papers. So we need to...
Code needs productization and go-to-market, so do we.
And don't forget, everybody loves stickers.
Continue. So what are some of the things in terms of, product, go-to-market, accessibility? Again, think ambitiously, a year from now, what are some of those things that we want to have? Duncan.
Like I mentioned before, but I'll reiterate what got said. Some sort of the economics behind the value of the use cases. So we have use cases. We say this is valuable, but just like the POCs are more I'll call it technical proof of the connecting the dots, some more of the economic proof. I don't know, a fair analysis on vulnerability analysis, blah, 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 that resulted in X million dollars is going to get more people's attention than, another document we put out.
I like it. Tommy, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Sure, Tommy Ross from BSA. This is kind of partially an answer to your question and partially just a broader basket of stuff, but I think it'd be interesting to think about risk associated and mitigation of risk associated with SBOM. I mean, I think it'd be, in terms of going to market, helpful to have a narrative to push back on some of the criticisms that I know you've gotten around SBOM providing a roadmap to the adversary and that kind of stuff. I think that would actually be, along with the risk of SBOMs creating more work for the customer helplines and that kind of thing that I know have been talked about a lot here. But I think it'd also be interesting to think about, like, what are the risks associated with the potential of SBOM producers producing bad information, and how can you mitigate that? And what are the other risks associated with sort of an inappropriate or ill-intended use of the SBOM?
I think it's useful and important. Further ideas of what you think we could use? Something that JC brought up on a call a few weeks ago was the idea of sort of a rubric or a playbook. I don't know, do you want to expand on I just put you on the spot. I'm sorry about that.
So I think that there's a lot of these things tee into business process, right? Which is always the hard part, right? Technology is never really the blocker. So I think the playbook is, so you say you want an SBOM. What are you going to do with it? And just as people have, their security playbooks that we're all supposed to have, people don't begin with the end in mind. So they want more transparency, but they're not really sure about what they're going to do with it. And if they have the answer to it, and the phrase I used is what turns green to red, right? So if you don't have one, that turns green to red. So like Bank of America was talking to us about how if you don't have an SBOM, they demand a discount. Not having one, and then, is there anything you're going to decide on the basis of either what's in it or how frequently it gets updated? And if you have answers to that, a lot of the chaff around these discussions starts to melt away because you know what you're after. And so that the strategic intent and the sort of the OODA loop of this, if you have some of those answers in advance, either as a producer of, well, I'm going to have an SBOM and I'm going to keep it updated and here's where I'm going to put it, or as a consumer to say, okay, well, here's my criteria and here's how I'm going to make sure they're met.
Got 2 fingers and then some other comments.
Yeah, and I'd reinforce that and even tie it back into my earlier comment, and you don't start with why do you have an SBOM? You start with, do you want to meet the DOCRA standard to keep you out of jail, or do you want to use fair analysis to reduce your security costs? If yes, here's how you use the SBOM to do it. It's not even a goal in itself. The goal is the business goal, and we show how to meet the business goal using it.
Yeah, this sort of follows on that, a little bit of a twist. We may want to publish something that is a pre-standard or a pseudo-standard, such that we can say, if I'm a procurement officer, I could say you must meet the NTIA guidelines for SBOM or the Playbook that JC was talking about or whatever it is, because otherwise I think people are going to kind of roll their own to some degree.
How specific do we need to map these to use cases? Right, this has come up at a number of calls, and in fact goes back to the challenge that we as a community were facing last fall, which is before we knew what we wanted to do, we need to have use cases. Before we knew use cases, we need to know what we were talking about. Do we need to sort of keep this focused on a small set and have that discussion? Or is this something that we can try to build a little bit as we go? Art.
I had not thought about it too hard, but at a glance, we might be able to sort of map to the modularity we've developed so far. So as there is core SBOM baseline identification information, you have to do module 1 and provide that information. If you then want to do license management, read Playbook 3, which is the license management playbook, which you would add on to your baseline. So that might fit in that direction. I'll stop there. I had something else, but I've forgotten already. So thanks.
Kate and then Duncan.
Yeah, the one thing I'd like to make sure we're doing, though, is actually considering and working with initiatives that are already starting around the world, please, rather than us recreating it from scratch ourselves, because there's a lot of work that's been going on in other places that we're not drawing off of yet.
Yeah, especially on the license side. Duncan and then Art again.
Yeah, so, and on that note, so again, we should at least make each other aware of efforts going on in those areas, because I know some of the people in this group have started new groups just to work on this stuff during the time we've been doing this. So I found out about one of them coincidentally. So I do think we should do that. Well, that's my main point. I'll leave it.
I remember what I just forgot was we may also want to choose to, if there's 4, 5, or 6 SBOM capabilities or applications or use cases, we may want to pick 1, 2, 3 to work on specifically. Not that they aren't all valid and good, but just to choose and focus our efforts. So,
Chris, then Duncan.
And I think this was kind of touched on before. I work on a number of different standards activities. I can think of 8 of them off the top of my head that make some reference to software bill of materials. Leverage those. I mean, there are ISO, yeah.
And 2 of the documents actually delineate, here are all of the things that have mentioned or are relevant to SBOM, either explicitly or implicitly.
Yep.
Yeah, well, I think they're already out of date because there's some new ones, so we have to keep updating that. On the use case topic, though, to Art's point of the focus, I think obviously we're resource constrained, but I would say anything that anybody wants to work on, we should encourage, because we have this sort of problem on the 80-20 rule that we do want to obviously cover the 80% case, but we do keep going off on these tangents on whatabouts. And the whatabouts do have to get handled because the people are bringing up legitimate concerns because that's their particular thing they care about. The high availability government case is very different than the, easy consumer case or whatever. I do think we need to cover as many of them as people are willing to put effort into.
Yes, and I think hopefully that may involve having to do some brainstorming about what is an efficient way to get that work done. And the other thing I want to prioritize as we sort of think about that is having that work done, but still having that be the community's ownership, right? What we want to avoid is having, this is, so-and-so's project, they went off and did it, and it's great, but it was just theirs, and it didn't have a chance to get input from and stress test from the broader community. Because I think that's both for quality and for legitimacy purposes. Right? That's some of the value here.
One thing I would say is if there are folks that are working on standards right now, I would say the flip side is also true. Those folks should take the information that we've gotten, which I think is, in my experience, ahead in a lot of ways, especially on the supplier, like non-licensing side, and bring that to those standards bodies and have them include what we found as well. That would be, I think, helpful.
Can I just respond to that?
You got a 2-finger? Go.
So we already are on the SPDX side. It's there was actually discussions about reformatting things around the baseline and then with additional capabilities as profiles, and that's already been taken to the SPDX group, and there's alignment to try to line behind this.
Something that we'll do this afternoon as we sort of do our brainstorming around different types of outreach is we will try to build the list of all of these folks that you guys have been working with and start to think through what a coordination effort will look like. Because I think it's, the term was used on a call last week, a framework for managing all of that information is going to be important as well. We're going to need some strategies as well as just, some having these meetings where every 2 months we get together and shout out acronyms. Yes, I'm sorry, Les.
It's okay. I'm not that important. So I think there's one comment that came out of and it was in one of our presentations on our proof of concept, the first round, that we may need to at least address, and maybe I'm the only one that has this concern, is a comment was made from the consumer of the SBOM that said we don't trust what we're getting. It's how do we validate that? So we can talk about providing them and everything else, but if the receiver is not trusting that, how do we get that trust? How do we get that validation to that?
That's a great point. Can you dive in a little bit about what the source of this is? It tampered with on the route? Is it a supplier had tools that you weren't sure about? Is it malicious supplier? Is it?
Go ahead, Jim. I was going to answer.
Yeah, one of the assurances that's not there is completeness, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that Art's group, I think, did a very good job of documenting, is the importance of indicating some measure of completeness. But then again, the trust side. Is there further things? Because I want to throw it open to the trust side of things, but I want to make sure that we've got as much from your working group on that issue as possible before we get a chart.
I don't have anything to add because it was just a comment that was thrown out. I wasn't part of the HDO side, so I don't know if they would comment or not.
Yes, I mean, that's a great point. And we did talk about that in the past, really, not only the trust, but the auditability. How do you even audit it? Perhaps that's something we probably want to include as a challenge that we did face. You heard it from here or separately as well? Here meaning like previous meetings? Because I believe I did mention maybe once or twice, yeah.
Yeah, it was actually in our proof of concept.
Okay.
We were going through it. And then it was in our presentation, right?
Yeah, so I think, completeness, accuracy, but then auditability to actually get that verification was a piece that we were missing as well. So that's a great point. Thanks for bringing that up. We'll certainly add that.
So, Charlie, on this trustworthy point, and I think there's some further mining to do from the POC. But.
Yeah, so from the consumer side, this is not necessarily a view that I share, but many of my colleagues and compatriots who are practitioners basically say, in terms of vulnerability, we've talked about, whether it's exploitable or not, they say we simply don't care whether the vendor thinks it's exploitable or not. They just are going to have to fix it because we don't trust them, right? So that's going to be an issue that has to be addressed as well. Can I just do this one thing?
Please.
I yield back the remainder of my time.
Yeah. So let's go back to some of the things that were flagged in the POC and that also the framing group had flagged sort of open questions around the very concept of the SBOM. There's a lot of work to do here. From a goals perspective, are there some things that you would like to have more progress done or prioritize? Please.
So I kind of going to go back to the ways to improve trust is to have correct versions. And that versioning component of, okay, so we have version 10 of our software, but which subset of version 10 are we looking at? And a lot of things that I see are proprietary software doesn't necessarily list out unique identifying nomenclature. So something with proprietary software that a vendor creates and it's their magic special sauce. Well, is it special sauce version A or version B? Something that builds that trust.
I think and is this the sort of thing that from an outcome perspective could be, here's some guidance building on what we've seen in open source and CPE and others to say, hey, by the way, regardless of what kind of software, we're not going to tell you how to do the naming, but here's some general thoughts, right? Everyone's going to still keep their identification in a certain pattern, but can we at least help shrink that space? Is that something that would be useful?
Yes, the more communication, more information is better, is effectively it. It's just more details.
Wandering back into the naming space, I think that,
Yeah, and if you start getting into that naming space, and particularly if you start getting into that naming space in the proprietary software, using the open source example, even open source has the issue of, you say it's version 10 of Apache, which really means it's of 1,000 components in 3 different layers, and which one changed underneath it. And that gets, at least based on email discussions just over the last couple days on one of our mailing lists, get into the issues of how much of the proprietary internal architecture do you want to release. Now, again, on the open source, it should be no issue because it's all open source, but you still, even there, we're not that good at it. And on the proprietary side, it gets into, there's an additional intellectual property aspect to it, that all of that we're not going to solve in 5-minute discussion. That's a topic that needs some depth to it.
So, poking at the naming issue, something I want to keep in the goals. I've got Jim and then I've got Josh on the phone.
One of the things that came out of the proof of concept was the topic of configuration vulnerabilities. So where we don't have a way of expressing different configurations of the software. Mike,
and not only configurations, but usage, meaning the specific function or method. And I use the example of the pseudo-random number generator in OpenSSL. Yeah, you may be using a vulnerable component, but a non-vulnerable piece of that component. And there's really no way to distinguish between those two nowadays.
So this gets back to the challenge of communicating vulnerability versus exploitability downstream as valuable. And I think looping back to something that we were talking about earlier, which is keeping in mind the customer perspective or the user perspective, trying to be clear about our language. What are they going to actually do with SBOM data? Starting from that perspective and working backwards.
One thing I want to touch on, we're talking about a lot of topics, and just coming from the tool vendor perspective and experience in ISA 99, working on the ISA secure certification for 62443, there's this careful balance of wanting information and the capability to do something that has the potential to stagnate innovation from your tool providers. So I just want to throw that out there to keep that in the back of your mind, because what we saw with 62443 was we had all these requirements that tools had to provide. And what we ended up seeing was this deviation from where we really wanted tool manufacturers to go to the slowdown in innovation, because it was too hard to maintain, validate, and qualify those specific requirements. So I want to plant that seed in the back of your mind as you talk about these things.
Trade-off of light, agile, easy to adopt versus something that covers all of the use cases we want. Josh on the phone.
You all work backwards to the point of let's not make this cumbersome and hurting innovation. Very recently, Gene Kim, the author of the Phoenix Project and a big pioneer in DevOps land, and Dr. Stephen McGill just published some analysis that showed like rolling forward blindly, even if you aren't concerned about the vulnerabilities or whatever, but aggressive rolling forward to stay current and on the freshest of ingredients had incredibly interesting characteristics for productivity, unplanned, unscheduled work reduction, et cetera, maybe to Duncan's point. So maybe I'll get that link to somebody. But that academic analysis on update frequency is a little bit unintuitive. It's kind of like doing automated build pulls actually avoids a lot of hassle instead of having to explain away why you're not vulnerable. So it's a productivity gain, and B, potentially going to decrease the number of times you have to have customer conversations. Number two, though, for the person who just said, well, maybe I'm only using OpenSSL for a random number generator, for a lot of these libraries, when people make such a claim, where they forget, for example, Java is a reflective language. If it's in the class path, even if you're not using the vulnerable thing, your attacker can, and you can chain attacks. If it's on disk, it's loadable and usable. So I would caution us against too much resting on, well, yes, it's vulnerable, but not for us. And I refer back to the first point I made. And then the third one is, it just occurred to me in this exchange for fear and apprehension between maybe vendors being reluctant to tell their hospitals everything they're using or show too much dirty laundry. Since Jen isn't here to curse, I'll come close to cursing and just say it's kind of like we talk to our kids with that picture book, Everybody Poops, right? We all have a historically unmanaged supply chain, and before transparency, everyone's going to have some level of spring cleaning to do, and cobwebs and maybe even skeletons in the closet for some period of time. It occurs to me that much like Katie Mazuris had used the 5 stages of grief, the Kubler-Ross model of the 5 stages of grief, to help people through getting a taste for the value of vulnerability disclosure. I think it was Tommy Ross's point, for people that have fear and apprehension, perhaps we need a very short, sweet blog post or one-pager on the 5 stages of SBOM grief, which is, yes, there's going to be some stuff you're not proud of. Everybody's in the same boat. The steps towards fixing that could be a whole lot of explaining away why you're vulnerable. Typically, the best here is going to be streamlining how quickly you can replace and update potentially vulnerable libraries and roll forward for higher stability, et cetera. But I guess my original point was the Kubler-Ross model may be a very valuable asset for us here, or something like it, because everybody initially is very scared to show, including in our pilots here. We're talking about pilots that aren't open, so it's a transparency project that doesn't want to initially be transparent. I think this just comes from a legitimate fear that we could maybe coax people through, because it's a temporary transition from darkness to light.
I like it. Everyone go get your CFP submissions in now and steal the talk title from Josh. Further thoughts on where you'd like to be? Because we've just put up, how many pages, Travis? Only 3 pages. So a lot of goals. Hearing through them, there were definitely some buckets. Some emphasis on processes and being constructive. Some emphasis on both tooling and refining the model. The need for broader awareness and adoption that covers everything from tracking and coordinating to making it more accessible and speaking people's languages, or finding ways to help them, as Josh just said, get over certain hang-ups that we have. Anyone want to start taking things off this list? That's the hard part. But are there things that we want to start that come up? You're like, this is great, totally need to do this, but this shouldn't be our priority. This is the dangerous part, because they're all going to be our priorities, but they can't all be priorities. So is there things you say, what this is? Duncan, throw someone under the bus.
I was going to flip your question.
All right. Turn your mic on first.
I was going to flip your question. If stuff's got to get done, then somebody's got to do it. So is everybody in the room agreeing to work on all of these bullets and then work down from there?
I like it. It's a good way of framing the question. Chris?
Yeah, I'm kind of flipping the question, too. I'd like to kind of normalize some of these and see which ones are higher priority. I really like the idea of focusing on automotive proof of concept to get some broader industry awareness.
Mm-hmm. And the nice thing is, some things like that are easily parallelizable. Mm-hmm. I think that's how you say that word. The other things we are going to do need a little more deconflict. So focusing on business cases, I think it's going to involve bringing some of these different pieces and parts together. Laurie?
I think in order to eliminate some of those, we should first do some grouping to see which fall in the same category there.
That was going to be my first pass through. That was going to be the over the lunch. It was more, can you guys make my job slightly easier by helping to prune or do some pre-bucketing?
The one I'd prune off the list then is the risk of bad information. We have bad information now, and trying to encompass an entire risk management model for incomplete supplier information both makes the job a lot harder and recapitulates what we're already doing.
I like it. Plus, if we are worried about bad information, we can sort of build in some of the assurance stuff that people are talking about so we at least can trace it back, things like that.
I'd like to maybe get some parameters on the timeline. Are we expecting, it's about a year now, I think? Maybe a little over a year.
Phenomenal question. I've traditionally tried to resist putting affirmative timelines, but also want to make sure that we're not getting into something that's very ambitious.
I think we actually, I think we've done a lot of great work here, but it took a little longer than I think we expected, right? So,
And someone, I think it was Josh, he said actually we can sort of think through our work processes a little bit, right? Having smaller teams, smaller tasks is one approach, because for a lot of the documents, I know that the heavy lift was some of you just sat down and wrote. And then it took us all a little while to sort of have some organized feedback around that. That was the time-intensive part. The labor-intensive part, I'm looking at a number of you, and thank you for all of that hard work on just the sitting down and writing part. Michelle, you had a comment.
Yeah, I think that putting these into buckets would be an important part, but I think that there would also be some value today with this group of people. There are things that we want to do, and I've heard it mentioned many times that there are already existing efforts. I think that we need to have two buckets. One, which is this is shiny new work that we're going to try to take over or take on, and then this is stuff that we need to do some research or bring in the right people who have been doing this elsewhere so that we can have a harmonized approach. Because I have heard a number of times, I'm in one sector, but there are lots of sectors, and there are sectors here that are not represented. So, I know that we've had a few folks mentioning stuff that's happening. I think that we should try to collectively get that down a little bit more concretely. So if we have something that we identify we're going to do, we also should be trying to identify other activities that are happening in that space that we want to reference.
That's a good point. And by the way, I also want to be clear that documenting an ongoing discussion doesn't have to mean abrogation, right? So, we started off with a lot of folks from a particular standards community saying this is all going on, and it may still be going on, but we sort of have lost touch and not been able to find the core of that activity. Art.
Well, I personally like the idea. There were a couple of mentions of sort of an economic study. Is SBOM worth the investment, basically? So again, I like that idea. I think if I were pressed for cutting something, I could choose not to do that, or for NTIA not to do that. Somebody else may come along and do it. That's not to say it shouldn't be done, but if I were pressed, that might be the one I would push off the bottom of my list. Yeah, not a strong sense, but just my opinion, yeah.
I think that's good as we sort of think through. One way of reframing is, what is this community particularly well possessed to do, and what are we not possessed to do? Having multiple perspectives and bringing them to the table, I think, has been a huge strength. But the specialized analysis for a targeted question gets a little trickier when we think about time, effort, how that work will actually be done. That's what we're going to focus on in the afternoon.
And really quick, just to be clear, NTIA unfortunately doesn't have the resources. This is Travis up here. Hi. NTIA does not have the resources to do economic studies or things like that on our own. So we are relying on all of you to do a lot of the work. So
this isn't even part of Travis's job. And yes, the work. Yes. Sorry, I want to get to Lori.
Yeah, I would kind of like wanted a little bit explain the reason why I brought this topic here is actually it is what I have seen while I'm introducing this concept to my side of the business working day, it's hard to bring this on a table without any giving explanation that this is going to work. So I wouldn't say maybe the economic model as a complete model would be maybe it's not necessary that much, but the somehow to show that this is going to be really work for you and you're not going to lose money. That's there have to be some way how to bring out this argument. I don't know what is the other option there actually.
That's really good. 1, 2.
Yeah, and again, I'd like to resist eliminating it if what you mean by economic model is the business benefits of doing SBOMs. If what you mean by economic model is some sort of government study that has all this government economics involved in it or something, then I agree. That's not what I was talking about. And that might be a difference between government and industry, but industry, you're not going to get acceptance if you don't have a business model to do it, and business runs on money. So there's got to be a fundamental economics of doing this.
Maybe to tie into what people mentioned earlier, I think what we're really asking for is a financial marketing playbook. How would you sell this to stakeholders as a value add?
And this came up on the use cases call, which is, what are some of the future resources and targeting them. So having something targeted to C-suite, having something targeted to some decision makers, as well as, tools that are targeted to engineers. Michelle, then Josh.
Yeah, I guess I would ask about looking at this economic justification proposal. So in the framing group, we do have that in part of our discussion, right? Because part of our initial ask from our group was talk about what the goals, objectives, and this got into this structure of our the overall NTI effort and why we were doing this. And we have gotten into that a little bit. I guess my question is do you need more than a single page executive summary about why you should be doing this as an industry, or do you need numbers, right? I think those are two very different arguments to make, that I need to know why this is valuable to me as an executive of this company versus this will save you X% of this and the X% of that. I think we need to understand that.
And the use cases document does, I think, do a good job of sort of listing out, here are a bunch of the benefits that could in turn be used to make a little more targeted case in particular instances. All right, I've got two fingers, so very briefly, Charlie, then Duncan, and then to Josh on the phone.
Yeah, all that I think is good, and the next steps in the use case team has been sort of a training, go deeper on the whys, a little bit of the hows, kind of provide that publicity and awareness that people don't have. And that could roll under the branding, and maybe there's a large, here's how we go, tell the world the gospel, right? Mm-hmm. So.
All right, very quickly, because we got a lot to go through. Yes, Duncan.
All right, so I don't think there's anybody on the planet more in favor of SBOMs than I am. I've been pushing it for 6 years, but I'm going to do something, I'm going to say some heresy in response to some of this, and that is it isn't always a good business case to do an SBOM. I don't think what we need is the ones and zeros of the dollars and cents of hey, you're going to save $12. What we need is how to do the business case, which I honestly believe in 99% of the cases will result in a positive business case that they should do it. But there will be 1% of the cases where it won't, and that's what business decision makers get paid to do. But we need to tell them how to do that. We need to. We can't just say, hey, the benefits are you're going to do this. The benefits going to be for your situation in your company, you should run a fair analysis and do the following and assess your vulnerability costs. And most likely it's going to come out that this will save you money, so do it. And if it doesn't come out that way, don't do it. But we need to teach them how to do it. If you don't do it that way, you're never going to get the decision makers.
So, and forgive me, it's the day of technical difficulties, so we've had some hiccups. I see a few folks on the phone, but not Josh. So, Bruce.
That was on. This has been on for like 10 or 15 minutes, and I forgot my question.
I'm sorry about that. Okay.
So I'll give up my time then.
Okay, thank you. Tim in the room?
on the business use case and how to see it as valuable, one of the things that happened in my organization when I was showing what SBOM was, Mayo, was we'd gone through WannaCry, which was a disaster in, not a complete disaster, but it was a lot of hard work went into figuring out what was susceptible to WannaCry in our organization. So our leadership already had been down the road to see how bad it is without transparency. Once we showed them what transparency was, their brains immediately latched on to how much faster our response would be and how much less work would be involved in doing an incident response to type WannaCries. So that's just what I wanted to share. If you have trouble selling it in your organization, and if they went through WannaCry and went, boy, we're really scared of this, what is it going to take? It is really easy to sell them on SBOM because they just look at their database and they go, all I do is put in a query and we're done. And they're like, oh, their heads explode.
So there are, I think you guys are starting to nod your heads around some of the buckets that you can see forming. There's the business case discussion of how is this going to be, how do we make the case, and also how do we help people do it. So, right, just, show the benefits, lower the costs. That is related to some of the awareness and adoption side of things. Could be similar, could be separate, parallel efforts. There is documenting tools, and then related to that is documenting processes, which touches on the business side of things. And then, of course, there's still sort of what are the open technical questions that we need to tackle. Again, I'm going to use the framing because we're talking about businesses of lowering the costs and meeting the targeted business cases. So what I'd like to do very quickly, Kate, please.
Yeah, on the tooling, I'd say documenting tooling and then documenting the gaps.
Thank you. That's something that we've always tried to include. That's a yes. What are the tools that we don't have? And this is sort of where we're going to start thinking about the user perspective. Most things in security start with the users, so bring in that side. So after lunch, we're going to start talking about buckets and priorities, and then we're going to touch on, what would the actual work streams, work items look like. The goal is going to be to set up a set of workflows. We don't have to commit to things today, but we want to make sure that we have our feet well under us to actually try to start the ball rolling. If we wander down a path and we realize this is kind of a waste of everyone's time, that is the benefit of this process. It is rare in government to be able to say, we can change our mind and say, screw it, we're going to go put our effort where it's better spent. But what I'd like to do is make sure that whatever those work streams are, if they're working groups or if there's some other thing, we can empower them with the grist of a targeted charter so that they can, again, get started on their work. And finally, as we head off to lunch, things to think about in addition to those work streams is something that Josh mentioned earlier, which is who's not part of this that should be? Who should we be reaching out to? Who are the perspectives, right? We've got folks from LF, we've got folks from Apache. Who else in the open source world should we try to bring to the table? We've got a number of sectors. Which sectors aren't here? We talk about the importance of thinking about how this data is going to be used. Who are the users that we want to have part of it? So, with that, thank you for all of your hard work this morning and all of your patience as we dealt with the technical challenges. And I'm quite impressed with AIA's staff to actually get things back up and running fairly quickly, as well as our webcasting team for rolling with the punches. If you're still watching the webcast, thank you. We'll be reconvening in 1 hour at 1:15, and we will be doing that fairly promptly, so for the courtesy of the folks who are watching remotely. So thank you all. Have a good lunch.